I am excited to be joined by Andrea Lopez. Andrea, please introduce yourself.
I'm so excited to be here, Ryan. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. I am a current teacher. I've been in education for 8 years now. And when I have not been teaching, I've been working in nonprofit, applying my communication background in those two spaces.
And a graduate of UTSA too, not once, but twice, which is
Woo-hoo!
exciting. Andrea, I know you've worked at other places before you became a faculty member. Can you speak a little bit about how you have employed communication in those jobs?
I worked for SA 2020, which is a local nonprofit, sort of like an umbrella network that supports other nonprofits. And I was partnership manager with SA 2020. And so directly in that role, I was able to apply a storytelling lens in that work. So I would go boots on the ground and meet with different nonprofits, some of whom were, of different organizational sizes and capacities. And my job was to help them tell the story of their work in an effective way, right? So just shout from the rooftops around the awesome work that these folks were doing, and again, that was a direct ability to flex communication in that way. We would hold partner convenings, facilitate trainings, and so there was this element of public speaking involved, but very, very much centered on relationship building and storytelling, being able to craft narratives around the work and the mission and vision of local nonprofits. And that was with SA 2020. And then, I've worked for the Rape Crisis Center here locally, and I was community engagement coordinator. So in that capacity, I was able to flex a different skill set around forging relationships, really sharing out the work of the agency, right, that I was representing in community-based spaces. So going to local universities and colleges or local businesses and just truly inviting folks into what can be a sensitive, maybe intimidating topic to broach, even saying, "Hi, I'm Andrea Lopez. I work for the Rape Crisis Center." I would get like bows and like, "Oh, okay," it's like, we can talk about this. It's okay, right? And that was part of my work. I also sort of unofficially in that capacity became the media spokesperson. So I gave interviews with local, news media outlets. I did a live in studio interview with Ken's Five at one point, which was really neat. So being able to, again, I keep using the word privilege because it was a privilege to represent survivors, to represent the work, the larger social justice movement, again, through a communication lens and capacity is what I was able to bring to those roles.
Are there any controversial aspects of this work that come to mind?
I think about the relationships that we day in and day out try to forge with our students as educators. I think about the conversations and the topics that we had to broach and create space for when I worked for the Rape Crisis Center. I think points of controversy may come in when we're talking about issues of identity and folks' lived experience. So I think that there can be a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of confusion. I think that there can be an element of just a lack of knowledge for some folks, possibly ignorance. And from there can be harm that can come from that, right? But again, that's where interpersonal communication and communication in general is so critical to be able to bridge those gaps and forge understanding where there isn't and build consensus and bring knowledge and bring awareness. And I truly believe that was always at the fore for me in what I was doing, specifically at the Rape Crisis Center, in my work with young people. It's getting to know someone's story, but ensuring that you deserve access to that story. And again, that's exactly what that interpersonal process and journey should be. It's this reciprocal give and take where that's deserved and where the trust is built. I think that it can be controversial for folks to talk about LGBTQ issues, talk about race, class, levels of education, income, immigration status. So these are all markers of identity for folks. We are complex whole beings. And when that awareness or that understanding is not in place, I think that there can be some fallout in communication and connection between folks.
Can you speak more about the harms and how those harms are negated with the power of communication?
Yeah, so harm can be done in something as seemingly small as microaggressions. If you think about the workplace or interactions with friends or a stranger, comments or jokes that are racist, comments or jokes that are sexist or heterosexist, that are so commonplace and accepted and normalized in society that these things manifest in day-to-day, everyday social interactions. And they're incredibly harmful, right? And often insidious. And then, of course, we think about more overt, obvious forms of those oppressions, right? Like obvious racism or obvious discrimination or prejudice. And so I think that communication can be leveraged as a tool for consensus building, understanding, social justice, change. And I believe that that change starts and should start, right, with something as simple as dialogue, opening up dialogue around this is my story, this is my lived experience, this is me, and sharing that out, and then having that be, again, this reciprocal process. And I think that when you invite folks into those spaces, that there really is an element of safety that can be created and welcoming in so that we can sort of remove barriers to communication and unity in those ways.
Considering the opposition to some of these ideas of acceptance and dialogue, are there any stories that might help bring this kind of work into focus from your work that could help those who are less familiar with the application of these kinds of communication principles?
I think of a couple of things. I think of an experience from my time at UTSA in my grad program, my master's program in communication. And then I think of a real specific event at the Rape Crisis Center. So at the Rape Crisis Center, we held a storytelling event where folks, we asked them to, with their consent, right? They drafted and crafted narratives of experiences that have been harmful or painful for them because of exactly what we're talking about, right? Lack of awareness, lack of understanding, ignorance, or willful blindness to things, right? This was held at the library, public library downtown. It was this open forum. Folks could actually come during an open mic session, right, who hadn't submitted beforehand if they felt so compelled to do so and share their story there on the spot. And that's exactly the kind of organic experience, right? It's structured enough, but organic enough to allow for that dialogue to take place. And there were no parameters around who could attend. And the whole idea is, hey, if it makes you uncomfortable to hear this, or if it feels very sensitive or controversial to think about this, or you think about trauma, you think about rape, you think about, right, these things that I think folks tend to turn away from because it is scary to look at and acknowledge and address. But that's exactly how these gaps persist and only widen. That's one event that really, through feedback that we got from participants and attendees, surveys that we collected, and just the authentic conversations we were having there in the space, it's like, okay, this works. This is real. And then at UTSA, I was a part of a dialogue structured event where the whole idea was this is to create understanding, not necessarily agreement. You might not agree with the other or buy into the ideas that you're hearing necessarily, but you will respect what's being said. You will learn to be open to hearing and listening different perspectives, right? And I think that's important to acknowledge as well, is that agreement or agreeance doesn't always, and maybe even shouldn't always, be that end goal, right? Or the outcome, but it's that process and that journey of sharing, of engaging, of opening up perspective that somebody else, otherwise wouldn't know, right? Because maybe they don't have the privilege of understanding a more oppressed or disadvantaged experience. And so that's exactly, in my opinion, the beauty of the human experience and communication, being able to bridge those individual experiences into the collective, right?
We're creating and I say we, but Dr. Sarah DeTurk and Dr. Lori Lewis at University of Texas at San Antonio are creating a dialogue center initiative, and they're looking at different ways to engage with dialogue across our discipline. And hearing you talk about the power of dialogue and how you were able to leverage dialogue for real measurable change, That is exciting. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of dialogue in your work and how dialogue can serve us in a way that helps us to reach common understandings?
The idea of open dialogue, non-judgmental dialogue between colleagues is so important, because in the absence of that, there can be a lot of fallout, right? And unnecessarily so. A lot of miscommunication can happen. And if we just paused and shared honestly and received openly, that opens so much space for folks to connect and to dissolve barriers or tensions that don't need to be there. Communication can be leveraged to bring those things into fruition.
Andrea, how do you approach people who might have different experiences or perspectives or opinions than your own?
I first would want to understand and try to understand those differences, right? So where are you starting? Where are you coming from? Oftentimes, what we perceive as differences become threats, become barriers, leads to communication, fallout, breakdown, gaps, right? So if you sort of, backtrack and you start at, well, what are you holding and what are you bringing? Here's what I'm holding and what I'm bringing. I don't want to sound reductive or simplistic in how I'm describing that approach or how that interaction can unfold. But I also truly believe that it is getting back to that essence of true sharing and dialoguing. I mean, I really think it can be that pure when folks are open enough to that process. And I think that especially when you're talking about, deeply held sets of values and there's larger societal, sociocultural forces that are influencing that or even reinforcing, right, those dynamics, it becomes trickier. And we talked about controversy earlier, and I think that's where things can start to feel controversial and get uncomfortable. But I also firmly believe that it's in digging deep and rumbling with that uncomfortable stuff where the most insight and knowledge and awareness can be born and can be revealed. Part of that interpersonal communication process is recognizing the need to create safe space for both parties, all parties, to be able to open up and do that, right? And where that isn't present or that isn't there, process isn't going to happen, at least not in any kind of meaningful way, right? So I always try to understand where folks are coming from, what they're bringing in order to meet them there, right? And then as or if points of contention arise or disagreements happen, or those differences become a little bit more palpable, then not being afraid to go there and maybe simply asking, hey, can we talk about XYZ? I noticed XYZ. Can we speak about what that was? Can we solution around how to avoid, right, this negative outcome so that we have a different outcome? So I think, I tend to lead with emotion, and I'll be the first to say that all day long. I lead with heart, and that's not always everybody's style. I think there's also an element of just being in tune with the different, communication styles and preferences of folks too, because, if you can sort of mirror and match in that way, that can dissolve some walls and create that safety that we're talking about for communication to happen. So when I think about differences of opinion or belief and how to broach folks in those spaces and ways, that's where I engage and that's where I tend to lead.
I hear you saying that you're leading with heart and you're really engaging with empathy. I know that can be exhausting. I know that can be hard labor emotionally. Even if you have a social support system that has your back, it can be just exhausting emotionally. Do you have any advice for people who are engaged in that kind of labor to help them through the day, to help them to fight through that emotional exhaustion of demonstrating empathy and understanding and heart when it can be so difficult to do that in these situations?
Step one, acknowledge that it's hard. Just say out loud, this is tough. I am tired, right? Use the word burnout. That's okay. There is nothing wrong or taboo around admitting that it's tough. I think that's step one, because I think where part of the exhaustion can stem from is in avoiding that acknowledgement, right? I think the other piece is what I said before. And it's not always easy to hold on to, especially in moments of pure exhaustion or burnout or despair or hopelessness, maybe even just around the state of affairs, right? But it is constantly starting and ending and leading with that ideal that we want to see, that ideal that isn't in existence just yet in all forms and all ways, but continually holding on to that, because that's the good work. That's what makes it the good work, that it is difficult, makes it worthy and necessary, not stopping when it gets tough, because to stop in those efforts or in that work, in my mind, in my mind and heart, would be to become a part of the problem. So you don't stop, you keep going. And it's why this fight is just for a few, and that's okay. And when you do lead with heart, that can be exhausting, especially when that's not always everybody's style, right? I think that having the social supports is critical as well. Having the outlets is necessary. Being able to reflect and take time for self-care is essential. And there also is something very empowering and cathartic about being able to be in a shared struggle with other folks doing the work too. So, even in, the greatest moments of super exhaustion, to know that you are super exhausted with other folks who get it, there is something very, very connecting and powerful in collective experience. And so at the end of the day, it's about being driven by that hope of that ideal. It's why we're in it.
The words "eyes on the prize" come to mind from our study of the civil rights movement. How do you measure effectiveness? How do you measure success? What is it that comes to mind whenever you think this is working? How do you measure it? How do you measure the impact that you're having?
As somebody who leads with heart and emotion and believes in the beauty of communication to make that happen, I think that how do you know you're being impactful? How do you know that change is happening here? It is in something as simple as a conversation with a coworker, a conversation with a student where something problematic with a colleague of mine happened weeks prior, months prior, years past, and I've been able to engage those spaces enough with them and create space enough for that communication around, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. Here's why. Here's what it does. In effect, let's talk about, another way to speak, to interact, to be. And then when you see that happen, you see that unfold in something as simple as an exchange in the hallway or in the break room, it's like, okay. And that's the change of heart, change of mind, ideology shift that we're talking about. If you can get it that, right, then the other external pieces can have a chance to take root. But that's the real heart of it. And sometimes you can't quantify that. To quantify it would be to reduce it, or it's just that gray space that exists in the feelings, the emotions, the messiness that is human interaction and communication. Trust and rely on the fact that that is impact, that is change that you're seeing and witnessing, even if you can't put it down on paper or the program. So I think it's important to note that too.
What are some of the biggest challenges you've faced in your career, and how might have you overcome those challenges?
I think about my time at the Rape Crisis Center, where I was serving as community engagement coordinator, and then real specifically stepped into sort of the face or the mouthpiece of the organization. There was a really big learning curve for me in being effective in that role. So what I mean by that is I had to check my own biases, beliefs, preconceived ideas around that body of work, right? The anti-sexual violence movement. I was new to that specific space when I assumed that role. I myself am a survivor of sexual violence. And so at the time when I worked at RCC, I was also in my grad program at UTSA, centering my research on the intersections of sexual violence and language and discourse, and how, all of that's related and plays out in organizations. So I say all of that because I had to check my own stuff, be aware, number one, of what I was holding, because being charged with the responsibility of representing not just the organization here locally, but the movement surrounding that work, survivors, in that space. I mean, there's so much, right? And so I didn't want to get that wrong. And inevitably, when I look back at media interviews that I gave, or, narrative that I submitted to the Express News or for publications, I think, oh, I cringe at, I could have said that differently, or I didn't mean that, but look, this is how that came off, or whatever the instance was. And so one of my biggest hurdles there was just learning how to be effective in the work by going to the folks who were doing it well before me, the folks who held knowledge that I did not, lived experience that I didn't share, and learning from that. Literally, I remember sitting with my coworker and asking her, played back an interview, played back the Q&A, and like, did I say that right? I know I didn't. Was that problematic? How could I have done that differently? And then that played out in the messaging I was able to deliver, from, something like trainings that we would hold, to being out, in community awareness type of events, giving formal presentations, and even something as super critical and intimate and personal as directly interfacing with a survivor, potentially in the scope of that work. And so it was really critical to me that I acknowledged, this is my title, this is what I'm doing here for the agency, but I am not the expert or the authority. And I need to be going to the folks who hold the knowledge and the perspective that I don't, to be as well versed as I could be. And again, not just for the sake of messaging or packaging a message, but truly, again, this idea of beliefs and ideology and values, truly getting it, to be able to communicate that out and communicate with folks. And so, again, when I think of challenges or barriers, it's being aware of the beliefs, the biases that we hold, even when it might be difficult to look at that and evaluate that or acknowledge, and just be real honest in that assessment, and go directly to the folks who are living the experiences we aren't, who hold the knowledge we don't, because they are the experts. That's the beauty of social interaction and communication and dialogue. And that sort of came full circle in my work with RCC.
I know that we have some people in the audience who are wanting to major in public relations, and I'm hearing great advice for people who want to go into that field of work. I wonder about some common mistakes that are made, or that you've seen in your line of work, working in this public relations field for this nonprofit, so that those who go on to work for other nonprofits might benefit from those mistakes. Can you think of a specific mistake and how you grew from it?
Relying solely on myself in my individual capacity, in my role, was a mistake that I made on different occasions, right? So if I had to deliver a presentation, I'm going to draft this presentation, I'm going to practice it and rehearse it, and then deliver it, and that's it, right? So never bringing other folks in, getting those outside perspectives. So don't stay siloed in your work, especially in positions of communication or PR, where you're interfacing with the public and you're delivering important messages, right? You want to have that holistic knowledge base, and you want to gather feedback from as many sources as possible, to make sure that you're as effective and impactful as you can be. Because something else that I tended to rely on maybe earlier on, before RCC, was my intent. Well, I intended X. Well, that doesn't matter, right? Your impact is what matters, and how that lands on folks, your words, your interactions, something as simple as a smile, holding a door, right? These are all these elements of communication and presentation, and never taking those things for granted, never taking them for granted, never thinking that you're above anything in that way. I have my bachelor's, my master's, and now I'm in this job with this title, and this is my work. And again, there needs to be very, very much a shared sense of responsibility and, meaning and stake in that work, especially if you're trying to reach hearts and minds, right? And really affect change.
Do you have any advice for your younger self, who is starting out in public relations and isn't sure exactly if this is the right fit, or if they're going to be effective at that job, and they've got all that beginning, that starter, or maybe some imposter syndrome? We all struggle with those feelings. Do you have any advice for specifically our public relations folks who are about to step into a role that you now have performed successfully?
Don't overthink it. The fact that you are analyzing, assessing, evaluating, wanting to do your best means you care, but trust the process. Trust the process. Lean on the knowledge and wisdom of those around you. Always stay grounded. Always stay humble. There were many times where I felt, is this the job for me? Or I got this education, now I'm applying it in this way. Am I doing this right? So I think that you can become your biggest barrier when you start to sort of doubt your instincts, right? So trust the process. Maybe your path looks a little unconventional, but guess what? Everybody's journey is different, right? So I think that comparison trap is also something that can be really dangerous. So just stay in your lane, do your best, stay kind, and never, ever stop learning. You are going to be placed in different spaces, in different organizations, around different folks and different work. And so long as you can answer to your commitment and your investment and your desire to be your best self, that's all that matters at the end of the day.
In your opinion, what are some of the most important skills to have? Do you use a framework, or do you have a checklist or something in your mind that you often use in your work?
When I think about specifically an interpersonal space, because communication happens before we speak any words, right? We walk into a room, we take a stage, we get in front of a mic. And so I think being aware of the messages we're sending non-verbally is a pretty important step one starting point. And realizing that we're humans and humans make impressions based on that. And I would say just a general preparedness around whatever it is that you're tackling. If it's writing a speech, giving a more informal presentation, if it's engaging in structured dialogue with somebody. So I think doing your homework, being knowledgeable to deliver factual, accurate information. And people want to know that you know what you're talking about. So that element of credibility, I think, is key. Being someone who's trustworthy. And I think of transparency when I think of trustworthiness as well, especially when you're someone tasked with delivering messages and communications in that way. So being clear, being transparent, I think creates a trustworthiness with your audiences. Being someone who is able to build relationships with folks, right? You have to be adept at forging those kinds of bonds with people. Again, as somebody who leads with heart, I feel like having a real deep sense of empathy is also key. I think that can ground you and how you interact with others and the way that you present and live. I think that is so fundamental, because at the end of the day, it's real important to be mindful that we're all connected, right? All human experience is interconnected and symbiotic, even when, especially when we don't realize that, see that, can't see that. I think if we can stay grounded in that awareness of interconnectedness, all of a sudden our efforts, our work matter even more, right? There's something different on the line there with how we're interacting.
In terms of things that we can teach, if we were to refocus on that, what are some things that you think that people need to know how to do in order to do the job effectively?
Focusing on issues, not people. So when I think of something like debate, for example, that element of accord or agreement may not necessarily be there, and that may not even be the end goal, right? But being able to separate the person, the personal from the issue or what's happening at hand, I think is pretty critical for individuals to be able to do.
Can you think of a success story that you're particularly proud of? What made it meaningful? What made it have such an impact?
I think about my time with the Rape Crisis Center, and I think about the in-studio, in-person interview that I gave with KINS 5 during April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So there was a whole other layer of meaning and a lot of other things riding on the line with that particular point in time around the messaging that I was to give. I did not know ahead of time what they would ask me. I didn't have any interview protocol, or I just knew generally they wanted to hear from the Rape Crisis Center. They wanted to know more about sexual violence and its impacts, the work that, the center was doing, and the general awareness for folks. So I say I didn't know, I guess I did. But very broadly, right, those were some of the conversation topics I knew were going to be brought up. So I was excited, nervous, very excited, nervous. Thinking back, I don't know how I wasn't more nervous. I think I was just so, it was such a privilege and such a blessing that it wasn't about me, right? It wasn't about me. But I knew that as the vessel to deliver that messaging, I did need to make sure I was as factual, knowledgeable, prepared as I possibly could be. And so I remember I took great care and attention and time to craft some talking points. I checked in with folks in our education department at that time, fantastic folks whose specific job it was, right, to educate individuals and groups in the community around all the things I was going to talk about. Checking in just to make sure that the communication was as solid as it could be. And so just to be in that space with the bright lights and the reporters and the cameras everywhere, it was totally cool and humbling to know that I was there to talk about the things that I was talking about, and hoping that I was reaching those who needed to receive that message. Survivors who needed to hear some message of hope, individuals who turn the channel or change the channel when they hear the word rape or the term sexual assault, or they hear the stats around that, the realities around that, right? Hoping I was reaching those who needed to receive that message, and just being so thankful that I was the one to deliver that. And then getting back to the agency, that was like at 5 a.m. At Ken's, and then just going up the highway to the Rape Crisis Center, and my colleagues who had seen it live, right, were just, giving kudos. You did so great. You did a good job, representing us. To date, that remains one of the coolest, most memorable things I have done, specifically in a communication role, was with the agency.
I know the interview is not top of mind right now, but what were some of the things that people might have taken away from that? Since, this kind of interview has an impact in your mind, maybe you remember a little bit about the kinds of things you were able to share in that interview.
So I shared statistics around sexual assault and sexual violence. The statistic that I always would lead with and always made sure to mention is how underreported rape is as a crime. It is the number one underreported crime, and it remains so. And just how I brought some context around how systems and social structures themselves can be re-victimizing. You think of the legal process that maybe unfolds and doesn't for some, entering a courtroom and potentially facing your perpetrator. So all of these, interacting with prosecutors and law enforcement and judges and folks in the systems, which is why the work of, and that's kind of how I wrapped around the message too, how the work of RCC is also so critical, because we, the work spanned this spectrum of services that we provided. So we interfaced directly and trained directly law enforcement. I presented to SAPD in-service officers around implicit bias, and to ensure that, when you respond to a call of a victim or a survivor, that you are not re-victimizing, right? That you're trauma-informed, that you understand, what's happening there. So I gave that context. And then, I talked about some of the myths and misconceptions around sexual assault or sexual violence, that it's a women's only issue. It's not, right? Sexual violence impacts everyone. And this is why everyone needs to hear this message, and everyone should feel a stake and an investment in the effort to eradicate, right, that oppression. And so, and this is kind of I feel a word that's thrown around, and certainly not a word that you hear in interviews. Maybe I would have said this differently then, but how everything intersectionality, and how that plays out in the work that we saw there. And right, how folks experience multiple forms of oppression, not just on the basis of their identity as woman, but also their identity as queer, their identity as Latina or Black, their identity as, right, not having as much education as somebody. And so all of a sudden, this is the work, these are the conversations. And then, generally being there in the month of April, which, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, was really neat, because we were able to plug messaging around, hey, if you want to get more info, if you're interested or curious, you can come check out these events. You can look at our social media sites or our webpage and can come visit us directly for a tour of the space. You can chat with us one-on-one, right? So being able to literally bring folks into the work to sort of dissolve the barrier that I think oftentimes exists, especially again in social justice movements, was really neat to be able to bring to the fore.
What's the best advice you have about messaging? Because you just went through a beautiful, example of messaging for a specific nonprofit. Did you get any good advice about messaging, or what advice might you have for someone who's about to talk to the media and needs to have messaging at front of mind?
Being really knowledgeable about the work of your organization, right? There are just some high level points that you must be able to articulate: the mission, the vision, and then, I don't necessarily like the term, but I think of canned messaging, right? Or just high level talking points that you can use in any given scenario, especially if you don't necessarily know what kind of questions are going to be fielded your way. So just in a couple of sentences or a few sentences, what's the work of that organization or agency? How does it impact? Sharing some hard stats and facts around either the work that your organization is specifically doing and the impact or outcomes there, or again, the larger social justice space surrounding that work is also helpful. And then always some call in, some invitation for folks to know that the work is an approachable space, that there are people who make up the organization. The organization is people, right? So this doesn't need to be something intimidating to where folks hear the messaging, they get the facts, all right, they have some knowledge, and then it stops there. It's always that call to action that I think is real critical, especially when you're talking about things that could potentially be controversial or a little bit, divisive. Bringing that invitation piece to the general public so they can experience firsthand, here's the work, here's what this is, it is also, I think, critical. So when I sort of think of the ingredients, right, of messaging, those are the things that rise to the top.
In your practice with intercultural communication, what's one of the most important skills that people need to master to do a good job?
The starting point, I would think, before an action-oriented piece is checking personal biases. So checking personal biases, being aware of any of those preconceived ideas or assumptions that we ourselves hold, whether, we're conscious or not of that. And I think it's that self-reflection, that self-awareness that's key to be able to then broach and engage dialogue with folks. Because without, absent that link, absent that starting point, I feel like the communication would not be effective or meaningful, right? And I feel like could actually create barriers and more distance in that communication space. So checking biases, especially when you're talking about interaction and engagement with folks who do hold different lived experience from yourself.
Where can people find you online if they're looking for you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, and I have an Instagram. So I deleted my Facebook, but those are the two social media platforms that I'm on, and folks can connect with me there.
Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. This was awesome.